For my final project, I'll be looking at habibeh madjdabadi. I'll look at her historical background, architectural approaches, and reflect on how this relates to the canon. Starting with her historical background, habibeh was born in 1977 and is an internationally known Iranian architect, author, and speaker. She has held lectures and exhibited work around the world, and she has won many awards for her projects. Her artistic exploration goes beyond architecture, and she's making her mark in conceptual art and design. She's well known for her articles about architecture and design and has collaborated with Memoir, an influential Iranian architecture magazine, since 2002. She graduated from Azad University in Tehran in 2002 and shortly won a competition with the Cultural Heritage Organization in Iran for a rehabilitation project of a historical building in Shiraz. And with that, she established her design studio in 2003. Habibeh's influences and inspirations vary throughout her projects. She's influenced by many different figures such as Le Corbusier, Hadim Mirmiran, and Philip Stark. When she starts her projects, she always recounts a quote from Philip Stark. When you decide to design a faucet, you should think of water and not the faucet. So you should go back to the roots to solve the problem in a new way. But what drives her work the most is Iran's potentials, opportunities, and problems. She looks at creativity through limitations, whether that's her role as an Iranian woman or Iran's survival under severe economic sanctions, and she finds the power from these same conditions. For her, influence comes naturally and is not planned. She believes that traditions and cultures belongs to everyone regardless of their origin. So when she works with clients nationally, she relates to their culture and grasps their needs and does so while using Iranian architecture, and this is implied throughout her projects. Looking at the revolutionary ad by McManus in 1915, she believes that it's a manifest for architects and those doing creative work. It's called The Penalty of Leadership, and it essentially says that if you want to be avant-garde in art, literature, music, industry, then the reward and punishment are the same. Reward is a widespread recognition, and punishment is a fierce denial and detraction. She's also deeply influenced by poetic forms and spaces, which we can see in her architectural approaches. Looking at Habibeh's architectural approaches, she's known to be exploratory, experimental, and avant-garde. She likes the unpredictable quality of architecture and views every new project as a new opportunity for research. And with this, she uses transdisciplinary approaches using skills such as painting, photography, sculpture work, and writing. She emphasizes the role of cultural and geographical matters through contemporary expressions of traditional Iranian architecture. And with that, she studies materiality, form, and human touch. Combining these, she calls poetics of material, which means that she looks at the spirit of the people who take part in the materialization of her projects. She looks at vernacular materials used in new and experimental ways, and she looks at controlled imperfection and approximation of the labors of handwork. Habibeh is focusing on craftsmanship and humanization in her projects. Habibeh uses an artistic approach by imagining impossible, unconventional solutions. She starts with subject, site, and project conditions, which looks into context, time, program, sociocultural issues, budget, materials, etc. She essentially believes that architectural solution lies in project conditions and restrictions. And with that, she addresses roots and returns to the origins of things. Looking at the first case study, the 49th house, it was built in 2014. It was a finalist for the Aga Khan Awards in 2016, and it was built in Tehran in a lower to middle class neighborhood. The contemporary facade contained a collection of intricately interwoven modules, which was a standard cube geometry used at various scales, and the aesthetic was defined by a series of loose rules, with an integrated texture on the outside and window parapets embedded into the masonry on the inside. The material was mainly brick, which was ancient, modern, and belonged to the earth, and it was significant to Iranian history. The project was significant because the client couldn't afford to pay conventionally for design and supervision services, but they accepted the work anyway. They conceived the project as handicraft, and instead of using technical drawings, they used oral instructions that they gradually gave to the workers. This building method was different, where they used specific language for transferring technical information to make the project understandable. They trained the workers at workshops and gave them some freedom, which led to the spontaneous aesthetic for the exterior. They also reduced construction costs. The inspiration for this method was traditional carpet workshops, where the designer translated drawings into spoken instructions, and the weavers, who are unaware about the final result of the work, were able to execute different knots and colors each time based on instructions they were given. And you can see this within more photos. You can see the brick, the materiality, and the construction. Looking at case study 2, the lunar complex, which was in Loshan Valley and was made in 2017, the project was located on the heart of arid and the hot region of the Iranian plateau. The zoomorphic form with lunar skyline essentially applies the vernacular of central Iranian architecture of the hot and arid region and applies to the morphology of the land. The main material was pigmented concrete, which doesn't entirely look like concrete but resembles natural materials such as clay. The color and finishing texture responds to the surrounding ground. The lunar complex contains a petrol station, accommodation, restaurant, car park, retail shops, and all of this is conceived as a land art, a panoramic terrace and bazaar. Looking at the images, you can see the nozzle skylights, which recalls to traditional bazaars where the light on top organizes the interior spaces. You can also see the climbable roof, which is common to Atikanist architecture or indigenous architecture. Essentially, the roof forms into a public plaza where people can gather and walk from one house to another, and they apply this to their project. You can also see the entrance, which is a downward flexion and a vast transition space. It's shaded using climate-based traditions. And habibeh says that she designed shadows rather than light. So she created shadows on the outer skin and modulated natural light entering into the indoor spaces. And you can see within the photos and within the renders. Looking at the third case study, the Notre Dame reconstruction concept, the Notre Dame was modified several times throughout the centuries through addition and subtraction of parts and elements, but this has always been part of its evolution. After a fire in 2019, restoration began, and they sought to find its original role as an outstanding city landmark and legend. Habibeh's new interpretation of the ceiling and spire looks at the roof rising gradually in the center and creates a curved skyline for the cathedral. The shape corresponds to catenary curves, where essentially the building load is efficiently transferred to existing piers of the cathedral to then be reinforced. And this is done without compromising the stability of the cathedral. This is all in line with Gothic cathedrals and traditions, where you can see the rising up of the building towards the sky, and this reinforces the sense of verticality. The main material is inspired by the structure of birds' bones. The hollow skeleton improves the strength and reduces the structure's weight. People can walk underneath the new roof to see the city from the cathedral, when before you could see the cathedral from the city. And if you walked where the former spire was, it's now a reflective hollow space. You can see in the images that the tunnel of light connects to the new roof, and this is a way of connecting the past to the future. All of this was inspired by Le Corbusier's When the Cathedrals Were White, which he described the Notre Dame as a pure creation of spirit. So they created this new white roof, which addresses the original aim of cathedral builders and white construction. The white of the design restores ancient imagery to the cathedral. And you can see this within the images and the complexity within the renders. Finally, we'll reflect on the idea of modernization and what habibeh brings to the Western canon. So what does she bring? Habibeh believes that architecture belongs to everybody. She wants to break away from the associations between a higher social hierarchy with being able to enjoy a higher quality and architecturally designed space. Instead, she wants to find a solution for people who cannot afford the fee of an architect, expensive materials, and technology. She essentially wants to make architecture more human. Habibeh approaches architecture from an artistic point of view and views the future of architecture as maximizing diversity and cultural differences. And this is done by looking back at history. She emphasizes the relationship between contemporary and traditional architecture at a local and global scope. Habibeh is moving away from the modern era of architecture as a machine for living. Instead, she's considering the spiritual dimension of life, that an architect is supposed to be inspiring and to feed the human spirit through meaningful spaces, and she is emphasizing on the social role and responsibility of architects. Habibeh says that not following stereotypes and standard books in all aspects of your life can probably lead you to a more creative life. She is moving away from Western and canonical architecture and instead looks into unconventional and impossible designs as a way of inspiration. Habibeh valorizes human approximation and brings qualities of craftsmanship into architecture. She essentially believes that architecture belongs to everybody, and thus everybody should be in the process of creating architecture. Thank you for listening, and these are my sources.